Look up at a clear night sky. What do you see? In the pinpricks of the stars, do you see the pictures? Perhaps you know this one. It's Orion. It's very clear to see, one of the easiest constellations to find. But it doesn't exist on a flat surface. What happens when we travel through space? Is this Orion? Let's keep moving. What does Orion look like now? If you saw somebody draw this shape, what would you think it was? See, the lines that we see in our constellations don't actually exist. We invent them. And when we invent them enough times, they look familiar to us. Sometimes that seems like it's the only way that they can go together. But truthfully, those lines aren't actually there. The stars just exist where they exist. And we make sense of them in our heads the way we choose to. The stars aren't even arranged this way. We see a two-dimensional object, when in reality, it's three-dimensional and much more complex than what it looks like from our perspective. So what seems clear and obvious might not actually be there at all. This is similar to the grammar rules that we invent to explain language. From our perspective, it seems like there are rules that dictate how the language should fit together and what it should sound like. But in reality, these rules are just lines that are drawn between stars. Yes, we can look at them this way, and it's a pretty common way of looking at things. It might even be helpful, like using star charts for navigation. But once we dig a little bit deeper and look at the true nature of language, we realize the rules don't always fit. And once they morph and shape around, the language looks quite different from what the rule originally described. You might even say they aren't really even rules at all. If grammar rules aren't real, then what's the point of learning about them? How can we use them? That's a great question. Even if the rules don't actually exist, they do describe common patterns. If you had the opportunity to go live in another country and communicate in Spanish all day, your brain would naturally learn the patterns without you even realizing it, the way that our brains learned our first languages. Chances are, you've started absorbing some of these patterns already. Unfortunately, if you're like most people, and you're here, you haven't had the privilege of living in another country to learn Spanish. Luckily, because your brain already knows one language, we can use it to create some shortcuts for your additional languages. If I point out some of the patterns in Spanish, you might start to notice them more often when you're doing activities. If your brain is ready to absorb this grammar, it will start to say, "Oh, that's why the language is said that way." And your brain will subconsciously make a little note and file it away, often without you noticing it at all. By helping your brain notice these patterns when they come up, it will absorb the patterns faster. But be careful, if you start thinking too much about grammar, you will stop being in the flow of Spanish, and that means your brain will stop absorbing any of it. Also, if you start focusing on the rules of grammar, you'll end up finding, like the constellations, they're much more complex and not as clear-cut as we would like to believe. So what should you do now? Each lesson, Complete the grammar activities when they come up. If the grammar is a little bit confusing, that's fine. The goal isn't to learn the grammar. Our brains aren't wired to learn that way. And because the patterns are usually much more complex and oftentimes break the rules anyway, it's not really all that useful. Instead, grammar activities are intended to let your brain know that the grammar is there, so when your brain is ready, it will learn it all on its own. Other than during these grammar activities, try not to focus on the grammar. Just focus on the message being communicated and expressing your ideas without worrying about whether or not they're perfect. Your brain will do the rest. Acquiring languages is literally what it was born to do.